Everyone, I'm pro photographer Ian Plant, and welcome to Photo Masters Live. Today we've got an exceptionally talented photographer, Mads Peter Iversen. Welcome to Photo Masters. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
And where are you coming in from?
I'm in back home in Denmark for once.
Oh, fantastic. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, like kind of the elevator pitch, as we call it here in the United States. 30 seconds or less, your origin story as a photographer.
I started out in videography, and from there I got myself a DSLR camera. And when I learned about the DSLR camera, what a raw picture could do, I was sold on photography. Then I went into portrait photography and a little bit more, and then I kind of like just transitioned into landscape photography. Was that short enough?
Yeah, you could keep going if you want to.
Yeah, so I'm based in Denmark. I travel quite a lot. I have a YouTube channel where I make landscape photography YouTube videos every week with different themes about landscape photography. A lot of vlogs, but also a lot of what we call talking head videos, where I talk about a theme and show some of my photos and some B-roll on top.
And you also have a pretty large following on Instagram, and we've got your Instagram handle displayed on the screen. I think you've got 1 million followers on Instagram.
Yeah, about that. And I've had that for maybe a little bit more. It's actually coming up on 2 years, I think. But Instagram is everybody's favorite hating social media, and mine too.
You lose track of your followers once it gets past 1 million. You just don't even pay attention anymore.
No, the problem is that unless you're doing a very, very specific kind of photography and so forth, and videos in combination with reels, then you have growth. If you don't, then you don't have growth. And I was lucky with the algorithm for a couple of years, and that was when I exploded. But now my growth has just completely stagnated. And yeah, I don't know how many bots are following me, but I kind of feel that that's part of my following. Yeah.
950,000 bots.
Yeah, hopefully not, but it feels like it.
Of course, we also have Taya Iv today, coming from Belarus, who is our managing editor here at Photomasters. And Taya, do you have any questions for Mads?
I do have a question real quick. So you said that you started out in videography, but before that you wanted to be a teacher, or you worked as a philosophy teacher, right?
I didn't get to work as a teacher or philosophy teacher. I kind of like just went directly from my teacher's education to my master's degree, and from there into photography.
That's really interesting. And I think Ian has a similar background in the sense that he worked as a lawyer and then he transitioned into photography. I like to bring that up very often. But I think it's all interesting and relatable, because a lot of people don't initially start out as photographers and then they discover their passion. And for a lot of people, I think it's really stressful. Should I get into photography full time because I already have this other career? So I think your story, your and Ian's stories are very inspiring for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's super important to make up your mind whether you actually want to live off of landscape photography and figure out how to do that. Because being a landscape photographer is not a job, that's a lifestyle. And you have odd hours, you have to follow the weather. Luckily for me, I don't have a family per se, so I am more free to go where I want, when I want. So in that way, I can administrate a full-time career as landscape photographer relatively easy when I compare to a lot of my friends who do have a family.
Mhm.
Yeah, and you're in an especially difficult area for landscape photography. I mean, the scenery in the North Atlantic area of Europe is beautiful, but I find that the weather, you mentioned the weather can be rather challenging in that area. There's a lot of cloud cover, and that can make landscape photography difficult, because landscape photography traditionally has been waiting for those magic hour light shows, sunrise and sunset, where you just get beautiful sunrises and sunsets. And I think some places around the world, you'll get more of those than others. And that North Atlantic area of Europe is one of the places where you arguably get less than others. And it seems to me that this has an impact on your style of photography. And so let me actually turn that over to you. When thinking about your style of photography, what is it you're aiming for? How would you describe the way you make photos, or the style that you have? Or do you think that you have a style at all?
I'm having a hard time describing my own style. Um, if it's probably like a spectrum between like the dramatic wide angle vistas through telephoto vistas to the more atmospheric fairy tale soft forest photos, and then everything in between there. It's in regard to the cloud cover. Yes, we do, I guess, have a decent amount of cloud cover compared to like Western US. I'm honestly not sure. I haven't spent enough time in Western US. I think when I was there for 5 weeks, the weather changed as much as it usually does back home here. So I'm not entirely sure about that hypothesis. But luckily for me, even when there is a cloud cover, it's fine by me because I do like my moody photos. And like when the sun actually then comes through and you have a cloud cover, it just becomes even better and even more dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what I was hinting at earlier about the tempestuous weather of that area is it kind of lends itself to two words that you used, moody and atmospheric style.
Yeah.
And so I see that a lot in your work. And there's for example, a photo like this here,
Yeah.
very moody, very atmospheric.
Yeah.
And I recognize this location as being right in the middle of that tempestuous North Sea area. And this is the kind of photo that, in a way, I think you're forced to make when you're working in an area like that where the weather can be really challenging, because the opportunities for those magical light shows might be fewer and farther between. But I also think it's a beautiful style, so I think it's a good example of, as a photographer, to be successful, you've got to learn to work with what you've got and to be
Absolutely.
creative with what you've got. And I see that in shots like this.
You exactly. But you also over time figure out what speaks the most to you. It's funny you mentioned this specific photo here because I run my workshops and this is the Faroe Islands, and we usually always go to this location. I think it's only a single workshop out of everybody I've done where we haven't been able to get to this place simply just because of cloud cover. So I have had what you would call traditionally optimally good landscape photography conditions with light and sun and so forth. But this here is just my favorite rendition of this specific scene, and that is exactly because of the moody clouds and the composition in the shot and how the clouds like bend over behind there, and you can see the background islands and the sleet in the air and the lighting and all that. So I just find over the years that as much as I like a good golden hour, it's not mandatory for me to appreciate my photography at all.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said that. I mean, I've always been a color hog. I want to
Mhm.
have bold color in my shots.
Yeah,
And I've personally struggled with the more moody, subtle lighting landscapes, and I've
yeah.
been trying to force myself more and more to embrace that. And I think it's just a difference in style, but I try not to personally keep my style too rigid. I like to be flexible, and so I look like a shot like this, and it really inspires me to shoot the more moody scenes. And one thing I love about this photo, it's the little details to me that make a big difference. And
Mhm.
I talk with clients all the time about the importance of having a point of interest in a
Yes.
landscape composition, something in the background that will pull the viewer's eye. And it doesn't have to be anything particularly big. It doesn't have to be anything really dramatic. It can be something small and seemingly unimportant. And to me, the point of interest here is that one bird in the sky in the
Mm.
background. That without that little speck there, I think that the composition would be diminished somewhat. So, let me ask you, how intentional that bird was in the shot? Was it something where you just noticed afterwards that, oh, hey, there's a bird in there? Or did you see that bird flying around and you said to yourself, I've got to have that bird in the shot?
It was very unintentional. Uh, because this specific photo here, we've been standing there for, I don't know, 45 minutes photographing this scene. And we had these big clouds coming in from, like, if we're looking like it's a clock towards 12, then the clouds came in from like 4 or something like that. So they passed us just barely. And we were packing and kind of going back. And then I saw the clouds just coming into the position right here. And I'm like, oh, do I have to get out my tripod again? And I'm like, no, I just take my camera, because I knew it would be a panorama anyway. So I just pushed it to ISO 16,000 so I could handhold it. And then just took, like, I think it was 6 vertical photos with a fast shutter speed, because I could see the birds flying around. So I didn't intend on capturing that specific bird, because it was really just like click, 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 click. And then it was there. As far as I remember, I'm not even sure I did more than one go at it. And then I headed back over to the lighthouse, as you can see there.
Yeah, and I think it works really well. I think it balances the composition. It's a visual counterpoint to the lighthouse. You know, the lighthouse is kind of diagonally to the lower right of the bird, and so the bird brings visual interest back into that central area of the sky. And you know, if you just draw like an imaginary line from the bird to the small peak in the background to the lighthouse and to the bird again, that's a triangle sitting there in the middle of the composition that just focuses the viewer's attention. So I think it works really well. So
Yeah,
how much
it
are you
does
thinking
feel.
about visual design when you're making photos like this?
Uh, I think a lot about composition when I take photos. Obviously, this photo here has been taken so many times, and it's funny how some scenes are getting photographed again and again and again just because they work. This specific scene has a tendency to very easily become very right heavy because of the big cliff on the right.
Mm.
You kind of have the background islands, where it kind of bends down in the background to counterbalance it, so it works. But as you say, yeah, the bird helps a lot, and in this case, the clouds helps a lot. But I think a lot about composition when I'm out photographing. It does happen that when I'm working with this small display in the fields, that I think I found a good composition, then I come back and see the photo a little bit larger, and it's just like, it doesn't work at all. Whereas I end up preferring another photo I took that same morning, but I may not have put as much work into, but I took it just because it felt right. And that is one of the things I think you develop over time, that you have a composition or have a scene in front of you, and you kind of just like move the camera so it falls into pieces or falls into its right place over time. So it's this weird thing between thinking and not thinking. It's hard to put into words. It's an intuitive feeling you get.
Yeah, you learn over time to develop an instinct for composition.
Mm.
So, you know, there is a part of your brain that's actually thinking this thing through, but it's kind of in the background.
Yeah,
So,
it comes with
yeah.
experience. Like, you're like, oh, there's an interesting subject over here. Let's move over here. I can see that there's a foreground. I've never walked there before. 10 meters ahead, maybe I can use that to line it up or whatever.
Yeah. So, Taya, let's give you a moment to jump in and ask any of your questions for Matt.
I was thinking, because I'm not a landscape photographer, I'm just sitting here fascinated like the rest of the audience. I think just the right hand, have you ever heard of that? So I'm just learning. But I think also for you, you've developed your intuition so well, and you intuitively take photographs now with your technical knowledge. What did you struggle with the most when you first started?
Um, I kind of felt that I learned settings and all the basic stuff very fast. And when it came to composition, it was just about trying again and again and again, and then putting them up for critique with other photographers, and they could point out stuff. And over the years, you've kind of just like fine tuned it. What I struggled with in the beginning was probably probably seeing the potential in other places than the most obvious places. Like, Iceland, it's obvious going to Iceland because the landscapes just work. But seeing the potential I have here in Denmark, that I've fallen absolutely in love with photographing, I totally couldn't see it to begin with. Um, so yeah, it's probably that actually seeing, but you only develop that eye with experience. So I guess it makes sense that that's the one thing you struggle with before you get experience is the lack of experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It must have been exciting for you to discover all that potential in Denmark, right? After years and
Oh,
years of
so much. I fell utterly in love with it, like instantly. I even remember when it was. So it was back in the beginning of 2019, and we had some years with hardly any snow. And then finally we get some snow, and I'm heading up to probably the most famous landscape photography location in Denmark, where we have like this old lighthouse that some years back became covered by a dune that moves with the wind. So we have this lighthouse that sticks out of a dune, and it's quite a famous location in Denmark, and it has become a famous location within the landscape photography community. And I went up there, just had everything to myself on a snowy day in not a snowstorm, but it was a windy day with snow. And I just got some photos that blew me away. And finding out that I could get photos like that in Denmark, I was like, awesome. So I found out that I have this massive playground where I basically had everything to myself, and it wasn't over photographed like Iceland is.
That's amazing. Yeah, because not a lot of people can travel all the time. Like if you're a hobbyist, especially, it might be difficult. So it's always uplifting to realize and acknowledge that you can shoot in your backyard, maybe sometimes in front of
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time on my channel, like sharing my philosophy and my techniques to photographing in my backyard, photographing in the backyard, and finding locations and what to look for. Because if I can do it in Denmark, I think people can do it in most of their own countries. And the good thing was back there in 2019 that I figured these things out before the pandemic hit. So I wasn't forced to figure it out. It came organically.
We've got a question from Michael who's curious about your
Yes.
digital workflow. And he wants to
Mhm.
know, for this photo in particular, how much time you spend post processing this photo and what are you using for processing Lightroom or Photoshop or a combination of both or something different?
Yeah, so my workflow is I am in that way probably an old school photographer. I use Adobe Bridge, and then I go into Camera Raw, which is what Lightroom is based on, those algorithms. And then I go into Photoshop, and then I save it as a PSD file, and then I can always go back into Photoshop and change it up a little bit. So Bridge, Camera Raw, Photoshop. And how much time specifically spent on this photo, honestly don't remember. But I don't know, 45 minutes to an hour. It does it up suddenly. Like when you're sitting there and working on the photo, suddenly time flies. So that's my estimated guess.
Well,
We showed a photo before with it was like a long exposure photo with the sea stack where the lights is coming through, and there's like a hole in the middle. That specific photo I spent a couple of days working on, but that was mainly because I screwed up in the field and had a variable aperture.
Yeah.
So parts of it was out of focus and I had to line it up, and I made like a time blend with several different photos. And back then it just took me longer because I was a little bit more inexperienced with working with the photos. So, but today I'm working faster.
yeah, and looking at this shot in particular and your other photos, it doesn't really seem to me that you're doing a lot of extensive processing. Certainly not a lot of photo manipulation. Instead, I think if you're spending extra time on an image, you're probably making some very subtle adjustments and you're just trying to get the balance of those adjustments correct. So I can see, maybe some selective darkening and brightening of certain parts of the image, but it doesn't seem to me like this has been a very heavily processed photo.
No, and the fun thing is that most of them probably are, but my editing philosophy is to avoid editing mistakes, things you want to avoid when you edit, like
Mm.
making artifacts or what looks like fake light. And I want it to look natural. I want it to look in a way where your eye accepts it. But as professional landscape photographers, we all know that obviously it has been edited.
Yeah.
But I want to make it not necessarily as close to reality as possible, but in a way where the eye accepts it. And sometimes that actually requires a ton of editing to
Mm.
make all those subtle, small adjustments. The photo right here is obviously I turned it black and white, and then I put a blue filter on the shadows. I rarely do black and white, but in this case here, I had to edit it
Yeah.
quite a lot actually, because it was a very flat photo to begin with.
Well, this photo really stood out to me
Mm.
as being one of your more successful compositions. They're all
Mhm.
very good. This one, for many reasons, I thought was just one of your very best. And what I love about this composition is you've got a few things going on. So first of all, there's the repetition of the shapes.
Yes.
You've got the cliffs in the background, and that shape of the first cliff is repeated by the second and the third cliff, and they are stacked. So they're like Russian nesting dolls. One shape is framed by the next. But then you've also got the repetition of the shape of the person, and that's
Yes.
repeated by the sea stack in the distance.
Yeah.
And the third thing about this composition that I really like is the progression of luminosity. You've got the dark
Mhm.
in the foreground, and then it gets progressively lighter to the background, creating what is known by artists as aerial perspective. And so all of this,
Yes.
that repetition of the shapes and that aerial perspective just creates this visual progression from foreground to background, from bottom to top, that just really draws me in. And I really love how this all came together. Tell us a little bit more about the making of this image and what you were thinking about.
Yeah. Thank you for all the nice compliments. So this was actually originally a horizontal photo, so it was a little bit broader. There were some clouds coming down from a cliff on the left side, but I decided to go with a vertical composition and kill my darlings, in the sense that there were actually some visual interest on the left, but I think it pulled away from the viewer. In this case here, I also took it at 200 millimeter, which is you need this here is about equal to 400 millimeter in vertical. So imagine taking this at 200 millimeter. It's way bigger with the original
Yeah.
photo. I put up the camera on my tripod and just started my intervalometer, and then I walked into the scene. And it takes probably about 4 minutes to walk from where you put up the camera to where I'm standing right there. It
Wow.
is myself. And the first time I photographed this perspective was in 2017, and I honestly don't remember having seen anybody else photographing this perspective. It's exactly the same place as the previous photo, panorama photo we looked at. We're just looking in another direction. Um, but that was way wider. So when I returned here, as far as I remember, this is taken in 2019. I wanted to go a little bit closer, and yeah, it was basically it. I started out wider, and then cropped in. And honestly, I do not remember why I made the vertical crop uh, back then. It somehow was there. I was there with Nick Page. We were running a workshop together, and I saw his versions and saw my own versions and tried some stuff. So yeah.
Well, I've noticed that you are often putting a person in your landscape photos. This is a
Mhm.
pretty common thing for, I think we've got someone. Yes, here we go. Another one, another
Yes.
example of that. And I can also tell that it's usually you. You have kind of the same pose in all your photos. You should probably work on some different poses. Yeah, I'm
I'm
kidding.
doing everything I can not to look like someone who is posing in what I call the freezing girlfriend pose.
Right.
Like standing with the legs just next to each other and the hands in the pockets and then the shoulders up and be like, when are we done?
So I'm curious about why you include yourself or just a person in your landscape photos often.
So when well, you can look at the photos. This one we just looked at here, and the one before. If the person was not there, or I was not standing in the photo wouldn't be half as interesting. Um, my background is very much in um, fantasy novels and fantasy games and all that stuff. So I'm used to thinking about people in nature. I'm not necessarily going for that clean, human, untouched nature
Mhm.
theme that a lot of people are. I don't mind having people in my scenes. I don't mind having buildings in my scenes. I generally prefer not to have modern buildings in my scenes, but that romantic 1800-esque feeling, or a person where you show adventure and you show scale and you show the size of
Mhm.
nature. It is a very romantic way of thinking about nature that I have. I clean my photos. I try to optimize them for visually pleasing, pretty pictures. I'm
Mhm.
in no way, shape, or form throughout my style, if you can call it that, provocative, or I'm not thinking anything with environmentalism, or
Mhm.
I'm just going for the wow factor and the feeling of the final photo. That's what I personally like.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when I talk about putting a person in nature, I usually tell people there's three reasons why we might do it. So the first reason you mentioned is creating that point of interest, making the
Mhm.
composition more interesting, having a focal point for the viewer. And then you also talked about creating a sense of scale. Though I tell people you're actually manipulating that sense of scale because your choice of focal length and where the person is relative to the camera will make them look
Yes.
bigger or smaller relative to the landscape. So you're manipulating scale in a way
Yeah.
that's interesting. And the third reason is, I think you hinted at this. You're talking about telling a story,
Yeah.
and one way to tell a story is to make the viewer feel like they're in the photo. And so by putting a person in the photo, you create a proxy for the viewer, so they can like step in their imagination into that person, and they can
Yes.
feel like they're looking at the scene themselves. So I think the way you do that is very effective in your photos. It accomplishes all three goals perfectly. Taya, anything to add?
Nothing to add, but I have a separate question if that's okay.
Go for it.
You mentioned earlier your sort of love-hate relationship with social media, especially Instagram. Since you are so popular there, how do you deal with its unpredictability? And just as an additional question, how do you engage so that people really connect with your work? Because it's more than just posting photos in my experience.
Yeah, I wish I could answer the first one because I don't deal with the unpredictability. Especially with Instagram, I still have not figured out how I can grow more than what I did years ago. I have tried with Reels, I have tried with this, that, but yeah, people always talk about shadow banning and so forth. I don't know what's going on with my Instagram account, and I hinted to my frustrations with Instagram, and they are there. Um, well, I engage, like I talk with people, I answer most of the people I can if I can get to them through all the spam that I get in my DMs. I also try to generally go through the comments I get on the photos and answer the questions if I get any. So yeah, it's generally how it is. And the same thing with YouTube. I try to get through it all. It takes time, and I could probably, if I release one video on a Wednesday, I can use entire Thursday just sitting and answering comments. So I don't always do that. I try to give people a heart when I read the comment and as a thank you, but it just takes time, and I have a lot of other things on my program too.
Well, it's admirable that you take the time to reply to people. As you said, it is time consuming, but some of the most successful on social media landscape photographers that I've spoken to definitely prioritize that. And that's how they build a community, just by answering questions and replying, even just saying thank you really makes a big difference, because I think that is what inspires people to return to your page.
Yeah, people feel seen and heard. And I try again. I don't always succeed. I want to say that it is hard. I want to, but sadly, I only have 24 hours a day, like all of us.
Yeah, but you reply to emails very quickly.
Yes,
I'm like,
I definitely try keeping up with the emails. That's a priority for me. So if anybody wants anything that's important, write me an email, because there is a risk that I simply don't see it on the social media because you drown in all the other traffic.
Well, I think it's a fair bet that photos like this are why your photos stand out on social media, and they don't drown. This is a famous photo icon in Iceland.
Yes.
And, personally, I avoid icons like the plague. I don't like photographing them because it's often very difficult to do something unique when you're at a place that has been photographed 2 million times before. But if you're going to do an icon, do it right. Do something completely different. And that is what I see here. I've never seen this particular landscape subject presented in this way. And it looks like there are a bunch of maybe some frozen bubbles under the water
Yeah.
here. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about what's going on here.
So it's obviously a winter photo. We're just out of the golden hour in the morning. There was quite a lot of places. If you know this place, you know there's a couple of waterfalls and there's
Mm.
some water in the front, and there's also some water a little bit further back from the waterfalls. And for some reason there was just a lot of sheets of ice with air bubbles in them. And I think I took maybe 4 or 5 different places where there were these bubbles, and this one here was the best. It's taken with a 12 millimeter, and I had to really focus like this one. Like the Sony, I used the Sony 12 to 24 millimeter, and it has like a built-in lens hood. And as far as I remember, the lens hood was almost touching the eyes right there in front. So the bubbles are very small, and that's also why I had to like focus take it. I think it may be 6
Mhm.
photos or something like that. And I had my tripod just like on top of it, and that was back before I had a camera that could do the focus tagging for me. So I had to like manually change the focus for each frame. And it was really, really nerve wracking because the tripod was standing on that sheet of ice and it was really thin. Maybe one of the legs was resting on a rock, but it
Mhm.
was very, very thin ice. So you had to be very, very careful.
And I think this image is a good example of how a strong composition can carry the image, even if you don't have
Mm,
that amazing light and color. The light here is actually very subdued, but I find this
yeah.
to be an very engaging composition nonetheless. And I think this shot is a perfect example of how you can take something that's even completely ordinary, something that
Mhm.
people might not consider to be an exciting subject, and make an effective photograph if conditions are just right. I love how you took this scraggly little tree and made this dynamic composition, and the composition really is just the nesting of the shapes. You've got this
Yeah.
triangle shape formed by the gap in the storm clouds, and you've got the tree positioned perfectly within that gap. And just bringing those two shapes together allowed you to make a dynamic and compelling photograph.
Yes, exactly. It's I remember this day like it was yesterday. It's in the Lake District in England, and the fun thing is you say that about the tree because it's actually quite a famous lone tree to photograph in the Lake District, but it has become more and more scruffy over the years. It was prettier maybe, yeah, 10, 15 years ago.
So was I.
Uh, yeah, and myself. But yeah, so when I go on many of these photo journeys just for myself, I usually always go to a place where I know there's somewhat of a strong subject, and then I try to mix it up and make my own version of it. And this one was one of those where I was quite lucky because we had these big showers coming in, and there was a lot of water coming in. It's just like one fast shot. There's no long exposure. You can see the droplets on the water in the background. I remember I looked up and I saw this cloud coming in from behind me, and I just knew that that would be quite fun to line up or capture the tree in this triangular shape here of the cloud. And I remember back then, I think I put everything like on a 2 second shutter delay to get the sharp photo. So I had to like guess and line up when it was at the right time. And luckily I nailed it. I think I only have like managed to get 2 versions of this one because of how fast the clouds actually moved.
Yeah, and when those storm clouds come in, you can get some really amazing conditions. And to me,
Yeah.
it's that transition of weather that is the best time to do landscape photography. And a lot of times, you can even do effective landscape photography in the middle of the day when you've got that weather front coming in. And
Oh,
not only
absolutely.
do you
Yeah.
get the amazing clouds, but sometimes you just get these amazing effects from the weather, like wind. Wind can really transform a landscape as it's doing here. I mean, it looks to me like the waterfall is going uphill because of the wind.
Yeah, yeah. It's this is the biggest waterfall in the Faroe Islands, and sometimes yeah, the wind can be quite strong in the Faroes, and if it comes from the east, uh, this waterfall just gets blown up the mountain. I have another photo of this waterfall from way further back where you can really see that effect of it being blown back up. But here, very close up, I think I took this at 12 millimeter. I'm almost underneath the waterfall.
Yeah.
And yeah, the water is just getting blown back up. This here is also like uh, 2 photos I have merged together. Slow, a fast, long exposure is what I call it, of maybe half a second for the foreground, and then a fast shot for the background.
You gotcha. Okay. And once again, we see that subdued color palette, which I think is
Yeah.
is common with a lot of your work from this area. And we see composition and the story driving the success of the photograph. And I wanted to
Fact of
talk
the
about
matter
this
is,
photo as well.
yeah, yeah. So the fact of the matter is that in many circumstances, I just don't have a lot of color to work with. So
Yeah.
there's not, and I generally don't like to emphasize or push the colors too much if they're not there. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have noticed that there is that rather subdued color palette, almost kind of like a very soft blue yellow color split in a lot of your
Mm,
photos. But the colors are very pastel. And so
yeah.
this photo I really wanted to talk about because there's a few things you've done here that subvert the traditional landscape style. The most prominent one is that you didn't make any effort to keep your foreground in focus here. So I'm guessing that you took a lower perspective and were zooming in with a longer lens, and you let the foreground stay out of focus, which is very much not what landscape photographers typically do.
It's not what I do typically myself either. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. So
So
I keep talking about it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like I'm just
It,
curious, whether this was something that just happened. You were shooting with a longer lens and couldn't keep everything in focus, and this was before focus stacking, or whether you made a deliberate choice to
it
do that.
it was definitely a deliberate choice here. I did try some focus stacks on it, but I'm actually zoomed in quite a lot here. I'm thinking I'm like 50, 60 millimeter or something like that. And when you start zooming into that, and you have a foreground and I'm as close to the foreground as I am, you will start to need to do a lot of exposures to focus stack everything. But I very fast found out, and what I found out over the years, that when I zoom in, I don't necessarily actually want the foreground to be completely in focus. And I found out, especially with this one, that by not having it in focus, I could capture all that glittering bokeh effect
Mm.
in the snow, because the sun is kind of like out to the side, and you get that glittering in the snow. And I think that's an effect that I really really like because it shows that it is snow that's there.
Yeah, I definitely think that the out of focus highlights, the specular highlights in the foreground
Mm.
are very critical to the success of this composition. And, selective focus is a tricky thing. It can, it's obviously very common with wildlife and with people. And selective focus on your main subject can help focus attention on that
Yes.
subject. But if you've
Yes.
got an area that's out of focus, that can also distract the viewer. which I think is why we tend not to do it with landscape photography. We like having that in focus background because that just facilitates the viewer's movement to the landscape scenery. That in focus foreground because it facilitates the viewer's movement to that background scenery. And I think, having an out of focus foreground with most landscape shots is just jarring. It just draws the viewer's eye. But here it works perfectly. And I think it's a lovely composition.
Yeah, I guess it's an ongoing discussion because theoretically the part that is out of focus should be softer and
Mm.
less contrasty, and as our eyes have a tendency to go to the more contrasty parts of the scene. So in that way, it theoretically should go to the tree, obviously, and you have that softer foreground. But especially when we're used to these wide angle compositions
Mhm.
in landscape photography, it it's when we look at it with our eyes, it's not out of focus. So in that way, a big part of the photo will end up being out of focus, and that is
Yeah.
not really what we always want.
Right, exactly. And so another thing that you did with that photo that subverts expectations is, the background is the sharp part. The foreground
Mhm.
is the less contrasty part.
Yeah.
Usually with landscape scenes, the opposite is true. Like with this photo here, usually the foreground has more contrast and more appearance of sharpness. And the background, because of that aerial perspective, tends to look a little bit more hazy and a little less
Mm,
well defined. And so the contrast between the previous photo and this photo, I think, is very obvious and very clear.
absolutely. Yeah. So this photo here is from the highlands of Iceland. I took it with a drone, and this is what you would. It depends how you define what is heavily edited, but this one I would say is heavily edited because it's far from the raw file. I haven't changed physically any of the things, but the colors and the tones I've changed quite dramatically. Added some darkening on top to frame the mountain there in the middle and have really the glacier rivers stand out on that black sand. It was quite a lot more hazy and warm, the original photo here.
Hmm. Yeah, so that gets back to what I was saying earlier about that soft color palette, and I
Mm,
definitely see you shifting a lot of these images to a cooler tone, which I think is effective when you're photographing weather like that. And I once again I just see this very subtle color palette from you,
yeah.
and it's got me thinking that I need to move in that direction a little bit. My style has always been very bold, contrasty, and colorful. And it's probably because I shot color slide film for 10 years before switching over to
Mm.
digital. That's how old I am. I used to shoot film. Um,
That's
but color
interesting.
slide film had this very vibrant color palette. And that's just, to me, that's what photographs should look like. And when I look at a photo like this is got that soft, cool pastel color palette. This is all about mood and just the simplicity of the composition. It's not about that bold contrast or color or light or anything like that. And I think it's very effective and it's something that's missing from my portfolio.
Yeah, so this specific photo is the one I mentioned before, the lighthouse in the
Mm.
dune. I photographed on that winter's day. And here I've actually added a ton of contrast to make it actually stand out more and make the sky even more dark than it was, just to have those individual streaks of snow coming out, and you can kind of see the waves in the snow there. And the thing is, it's funny you mention the thing with you being used to photographing with a lot of color. Uh, Besides the fact that a lot of the landscapes I photograph, I don't think have a whole lot of color. Uh, it's also a question about. I think I'm obviously we all have our background, and I have my like Scandinavian minimalism in me, where it's just not a big thing in
Mm.
our society to have a whole lot of color splashes everywhere, which is fun. Because when I had James Popsis over from England and we walked around Copenhagen, he said it was a very colorful city. But yeah, it's quite funny. But color is not something that I pursue. I'm a little bit colorblind, but I won't say it influenced my philosophy with color. It's only the tone, red green ish tones that are very close to each other that
Right.
I kind of mix up and can't see the difference in. So there are sometimes there's some magenta areas, some cyan areas, maybe some reds or greens, where my girlfriend come in mess. Are you sure it's supposed to look like that? I'm like, I'm definitely sure it's not supposed to look like that. So thanks for saying. But generally, it's color is not something. It was something I did to begin with, just because it looked
Mm.
so dramatic. But I kind of work more in tones and atmosphere and yeah, contrast in my photos. Even though it's an atmospheric photo I take,
Mm.
it usually I usually use the full dynamic range. When you go into Lightroom or Photoshop and you see the histogram, I usually fill it out.
Mhm.
So I have a black point, white point. So that's the technical terms.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I definitely see that, that reliance on atmosphere in a lot of your
Mm.
photos. And
Oh, I love fog. Like
yeah.
it's just it's amazing to work with. It gives that fairy tale, dreamy feeling to the photo.
Exactly. Everything is ethereal, and a
Yes,
shot like this, I
exactly.
think, really shows that. And I love the mix of the natural ambient twilight here with the artificial light. I think that warm cool is very effective, and this is just a lovely image.
Yeah, it's the classic blue hour thing when you photograph any like ambient light lit uh, subject, whatever building it is, and you photograph again in the blue hour. It just works really, really well. And the specific photo here being from Slovenia, they have so many just like lone, small, old churches on
Mhm.
hilltops and mountaintops all the way around the country. So it's just a fascinating country to go to and get scenes like this because they also get a lot of like atmosphere.
Yeah. Yeah, we can see it once again here, and once again
Yeah,
that kind of yellow blue split tone that
yeah,
I think is rather common. And so it's interesting that you mentioned being a little bit colorblind with green and red, and so maybe that
yeah,
explains the shift to yellow and blue.
yeah. I guess like yellow and blue is like it's orange and teal. It's what we're used to. Shadows being colder and highlights being warmer. It's quite a natural way. Of, I don't use split toning. It's just when it's there,
Right.
and then I work with that.
Yeah, yeah. And compositionally, I'm very happy to see that you're not afraid of putting things in the middle. I think the
Oh, I
middle
do
of
it
the
all the
composition gets a bad name. There's all these
Yeah.
so-called rules of composition that encourage people to be away from the middle. And I'm
Mm.
constantly trying to tell people that it's okay to put things in the middle if you do it right. And composition like this is very, very much symmetrical, both left to right and top to bottom. But I think it works perfectly.
Exactly. Like I have my ebooks on composition, and I have a couple of chapters where I discuss center versus off center compositions.
Yeah.
And as you exactly say, this here is an obvious example where you would want to place your subject straight in the middle because it's just so symmetrical, both on the x-axis and the y-axis.
Mm. Yeah, and I tell people that when you make a centered composition, you have to find a way to break up the symmetry so that you add some visual interest. And so where you do that here is, on the left side. The left side is a bit different than the right side. So there's
Mm-hmm.
there's more visual interest on the left than on the right. That helps break up the symmetry and inject some visual energy into this otherwise very tranquil composition. And you've got the
Yes.
clouds forming lines, you've got the reflection of the hills forming lines, and so these lines have energy, they help direct the viewer's eye to different parts of the composition, so I think this works really well.
Yeah, you can easily imagine like if there was like a foreground bird or swan or maybe a boat or something like that in the scene, then you would off center the composition to balance out with the
Mhm.
foreground boat. But in this case here, it was just like so clean and tranquil that just don't think of it straight on. Like
Yeah.
don't try to force something that's not there.
Well, you could have done the whole classic pick up a pebble and throw it in the water to get the ripple, but that's just so dumb and
Absolutely.
cliche.
And
And
it would
and
require
once
me to
again, this
actually
is
hit the right place.
right. And once again, this is a pretty centered image. The visual interest from left to right is very well balanced in the middle, but the
Mm.
strong diagonal lines created by the streaks of shadow and light over the
Yeah.
mist really helps this work. Is this a drone shot?
Yes, it is. It's from Denmark,
Hmm.
and because we don't we have hills, but our tallest hill above the ocean surface is like 180 meters or something like that.
Mm.
We are quite a flat country, so if you need this dramatic perspective, there's not a whole lot of places in Denmark you can get that. So I tend to use my drone quite a lot to get above the forests and treetops and get these perspectives. And this morning here was it's one of the best mornings I've had for landscape photography in like ever.
Yeah.
I got so many photos, just like perfect foggy conditions with the sunrise, and
Mm.
I think I got maybe, I don't know, 8 portfolio photos from this morning, and 6 of them is my favorite from last year. So
Wow.
it was crazy.
And once again, I think it's a good example of how you can make very effective photographs, even of subjects that other people might think aren't that interesting. And so you've got this forest that's probably fairly nondescript, but in the right conditions, it's transformed into something completely magical. And
Exactly. Yeah, a forest like that, we have so many of those sprouse tree plantations all over Denmark. Like this could be anywhere. It just so happens that was where I was, and I saw that, oh, there was this light interaction, so I took the shot.
yeah, fantastic. And this photo I just absolutely love.
Yeah.
I love the visual progression, the S curve. The shape is really defined by the bright green in the foreground. So
Hmm.
it's the river creates the shape, but that bright green surrounding it emphasizes the shape, and it just creates that beautiful S curve to the background and that little hint of light on the mist over the mountains. And this I think works really well. And that bright foreground, normally when I'm thinking of my transition from foreground to background, I want the background to be brighter than the foreground because that's
Yeah.
where I want to lead the eye. But here having that bright foreground, I think works really well because there's a lot that draws the viewer to the background, but then when the viewer's done, the viewer gets pulled back to that bright green and that starts the visual journey all over again.
Yeah, and the funny thing is with that bright green, it's the moss in Iceland. This is the Icelandic highlands,
Mhm.
and that moss is a nightmare to edit because the second you put in just a little bit of contrast in the photo, that greens just blow out.
Right.
You do not believe how green this moss is, and it
Yeah.
looks almost unrealistic. You have to desaturate it because else people won't accept it. This photo here, like when I took it, it was a little bit more of a flat day, so I added a decent amount of contrast to make those clouds stand out on top of the
Mhm.
mountains. I
Yeah.
didn't per se, the classic dodge and burn, but I just added a lot of contrast to the background, so they stood out a little bit more.
Yeah, I think you needed to balance
Yeah.
the brightness of the foreground. You really needed to have that bright background. This is what I call the halo effect when you've got something
Mm.
that is bright behind your main subject. So here that cloud is creating this white halo around the mountains, and that's helping
Mm.
draw the viewer to that spot. And I think it works
Yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll just end with the volcano shot. Yeah, this
Yeah.
is
So this here is from the second eruption in Iceland in this cycle here.
Mhm.
In 2022, the summer of 2022, I got up there and I was lucky enough that the workshop I was hosting, I was actually substituting on that workshop, lined up with an active volcano. So we went there and spent a good afternoon and into the night there. It's a drone shot, and this one was taken late afternoon, but it wasn't really particularly dark. It's just
Mhm.
the thing about photographing volcanoes is that it's really hard to actually show how glowy a volcano is, how glowy lava is. You see it on photos, you see it on in movies, film, or YouTube videos, but it's a completely different feeling being there yourself. Like it's I have not experienced a person who wasn't like mind blown seeing real lava for the first time, because it looks different in reality and it's hard to show. In this case here, it was a drone shot, three three horizontal photos I took,
Mhm.
and then merged them together as a vertical panorama.
Yeah, the brilliance of the lava really just exceeds the
Mm,
dynamic range of the camera, and
yeah.
so you just can't, a digital sensor can't capture that much red,
No.
and so something is lost when you take the photo. But
Yes.
part of our job as photographers is to have an experience and to see
Yeah.
something that other people aren't seeing. And then we have to figure out a way to translate that experience. A photograph is never a perfect proxy for that experience. So we have
Mm,
to basically translate it and, try to guide the viewer into seeing what it is that we're seeing, to feeling that
yeah.
experience. And
Yeah.
so we've reached, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny with lava, because I was also in Iceland last year, where there was another eruption, and it was funny when I edited these photos. Like, I didn't manage to capture the entire dynamic range of the lava, actually to such a degree that it almost was too flat looking at the lava. So I had to go in Photoshop and make a luminosity mask that was only visible on the very most highlights, and then I just blew them out. And that gave that specular highlight on top of the lava, so it actually looks more realistic.
Mhm.
Even though I managed to capture all the information in the camera, I had to technically destroy those highlights to make it look more realistic.
Yeah, that there's always the artistic challenges and the technical
Mm.
challenges as well. Well, we're
Yeah.
getting to the end of the program. Taya, if you have any additional questions for Mads, and in the meantime, if anyone has any last questions for Mads, put them in the chat. And while Taya is asking her question, I'll take a look at the chat and see if there any more questions come in.
So something that I noticed throughout this conversation slash interview is that you break photography rules, and you do that very fearlessly, and you enjoy doing that, and it results in really interesting photographs. Is there another popular photography rule that you don't necessarily agree with?
Oh, the concept of rules, I generally don't agree with. We use it. We talk about like the rule of thirds, the golden rule, usually the golden ratio. There are so many rules about like how you should not take up the center column of the tripod. All those things, like, they're tools. Use them to your benefit. And generally, like, if you can justify breaking a rule, and it's or a tool uh, or whatever technique you want to use, if you can justify it, like, I do it because this, and it looks good, or it looks more realistic, or this is what I want, or whatever, then fine. There are a lot of photographers out there who want to be the photography police, and I generally just ignore them. It's like it's, uh, and that is also a thing you cannot do without experience, uh, and get the confidence in your own work and your own processing and your own philosophy. It just comes with time. But yeah, generally, rules. I'm not of the philosophy that rules are meant to be broken, but I just won't call it rules.
Right, right. I like to tell people that there aren't any rules. There are only tools, and
Yeah,
rules are for
tools,
fools.
guidelines, the rules of thumb. It's yeah, it's softer
Yeah.
than that. It's also one of the problems. Like, when you're a YouTuber, like, you always have to like make provocative titles, like, these are the mistakes you don't want to do, or whatever. And people are like, mistakes? There's no mistakes in photography. And I'm like, I know, but you don't click it if I call it anything else.
You mentioned
Well,
YouTube. Yeah, sorry, just real quick.
go ahead.
And Instagram as well, shadow banning. There are so many different platforms that you're active on right now. Is there one specific platform that you think has a lot of potential for photographers at the moment?
Uh, it depends how you like to create your content. I generally don't like the word content because it dilutes the videos and the photos that we make, but technically it is content. Um, and you have to figure out what you want to make. Do you want to make short form videos? Do you want to make longer videos? How much time do you want to put into it? So if it is social media and it's that road you want to go down, you need to figure that out yourself. I think it's extremely important that you make sure that what you do is something that you want to do. You will burn out very fast if you force yourself to make a YouTube video once a week and you don't enjoy that process.
Well, that is all we have time for. Thank you so much, Mads, for joining us. This has been a fascinating interview, a great discussion. I know I've learned a lot. I think everyone else who is watching this will learn a lot too. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.
And thank you so much for having me.